The forest was dense and dark, with thick fog creeping through the skeletal branches like fingers searching for something lost. Detective Marcus Reed walked slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, his eyes focused on the shadows between the trees. The ground beneath his boots squelched with every step, the wet leaves and mud clinging like an omen. Ahead, he could see a cluster of men and women in dark coats, their voices low, huddled around a grisly scene. "Detective Reed?" A gruff voice called out as he approached the group. Sheriff John Miller, a heavy-set man with a hard face, stepped forward. His breath smelled faintly of coffee and cigarettes, mingling with the earthy scent of the woods. "Welcome to our little corner of hell." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "What do we have?" Sheriff Miller led him closer to the body. The victim lay sprawled in the center of a small clearing, a man in his late 30s, with his chest torn open, as if by a wild animal. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the earth. Marcus had seen his share of death, but something about this scene unsettled him. Carved into the bark of the trees surrounding the clearing were strange symbols, almost ritualistic in their intricacy, twisting like snakes. "Locals say they haven't seen anything like this," Miller said, his voice low. "But they talk. They always do. Rumors and ghost stories mostly." Marcus crouched down beside the body, his eyes tracing the deep gashes that marred the man's flesh. "Who is he?" "George Langley," Miller answered. "Local handyman. Never caused any trouble." Marcus felt a chill run through him, colder than the biting wind. "And these symbols?" Miller's jaw tightened. "Something old. Something from the town's past, I reckon. But you know how these places are. Everything has a story, and most of them aren't true." Marcus stood up, his gaze lingering on the symbols. They looked almost alive, twisting in the dim light like they were shifting under his scrutiny. "I need to see the crime scene reports and any records you have on the town's history," he said. "Everything." Miller gave him a hard look. "You're not going to find anything useful digging around in our past, detective. Some things are best left buried." But Marcus wasn't one to back down. "I'll be the judge of that." As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His eyes darted around the clearing, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Still, the sensation persisted, gnawing at the edges of his mind. He had been in this town for less than a day, but already he could feel its weight pressing down on him, as if the very air was thick with secrets. Back in town, Marcus settled into his temporary lodgings, a small, dimly lit room above the local tavern. He pulled out his notebook and began jotting down his initial observations. The murder was brutal, the symbols inexplicable, but what stood out most was the reaction of the townspeople. They were fearful, yes, but not in the way one might expect. It wasn't just fear of death. It was fear of something else, something deeper. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus opened it to find a woman standing there, her face partially hidden by a hood. She looked to be in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to peer right through him. "Detective Reed," she said softly. "I'm Claire Michel. I heard you're looking into what happened out there in the woods." Marcus studied her for a moment before stepping aside to let her in. "And what do you know about it?" "More than most," she replied, her voice steady, but tinged with a hint of fear. "This town, it has a history, and it's not one that's written down anywhere you'll find." He closed the door behind her, his curiosity piqued. "I'm listening." Clara glanced around the room, as if ensuring they were truly alone. "The symbols you saw on the trees, those aren't just random marks. They're part of something much older than this town, something that goes back to the people who founded it." Marcus felt a chill settle into his bones. "Go on." "They say it's a curse," Clara continued, her eyes fixed on his. "A curse that was born out of blood and sin. And now, after all these years, it's come back to collect." Marcus leaned back, considering her words carefully. "A curse? You expect me to believe that?" Clara's eyes were unwavering. "Believe what you want, detective. But whatever it is, it's not done yet." A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling the windows. For a moment, Marcus thought he heard something, a distant whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. But when he looked outside, there was nothing, just the fog rolling in, thick and impenetrable. "We'll see about that," Marcus said finally, his voice low. He didn't believe in curses, but he knew one thing for certain. Something was very wrong in this town, and he was going to find out what. The fog clung to the town like a shroud as Marcus made his way to the sheriff's office the next morning. The narrow streets were deserted, save for a few townsfolk who eyed him warily from their windows. He could feel the tension in the air, a thick, almost tangible unease that seemed to seep from the very ground. As he approached the sheriff's office, the sound of a door creaking open caught his attention. An elderly woman stood in a doorway, staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. She muttered something under her breath, a prayer, perhaps, before quickly shutting the door. Inside the small, dimly lit office, Sheriff Miller was hunched over a stack of paperwork, his expression grim. When he saw Marcus, he barely looked up. "Back again so soon, Detective?" Miller grunted, his eyes not leaving the page in front of him. "I need more information," Marcus said, his tone firm. "Everything you've got on George Langley, his background, known associates, any potential enemies. And I want access to your archives. I need to understand what's really going on in this town." Miller sighed, setting his pen down with a loud clatter. "I already told you, Reed, this isn't some big city murder mystery. People around here like to keep to themselves. Digging into our past isn't going to help." "That's for me to decide," Marcus replied sharply. "Something about this case doesn't add up, and I'm not leaving until I have answers." The sheriff met his gaze, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you. Some things should stay buried." Miller begrudgingly handed over a set of files on George Langley. But the information was sparse. The more Marcus looked, the more it seemed like a dead end. He needed to go deeper, to get past the surface-level information and see what this town was hiding. As Marcus left the sheriff's office, he was approached by Clara Mitchell. She stood just outside, leaning against a weathered lamppost with an air of calm that seemed out of place in the otherwise tense atmosphere. "Detective," she greeted him, "I see you're not having much luck with our esteemed sheriff." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You could say that. Seems like everyone here wants to keep the past locked away." Clara nodded knowingly. "That's because some of us know what's hidden in that past, and some of us are still paying for it." "Care to elaborate?" Marcus asked, studying her carefully. There was a sharpness in her eyes, a depth that hinted at knowledge she hadn't yet shared. "Meet me at the town archives," she said. "There are things you need to see, things that might help you understand why George Langley had to die, and why others might follow." Intrigued, Marcus followed Clara to the old town archives, housed in a small, nondescript building at the edge of town. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves of old books and records, some dating back more than a century. Clara led him to a section marked Town History and pulled out a large leather-bound volume. "This is where it all started," she said, opening the book to a page filled with faded writing and an intricate drawing of a symbol, one that matched the carvings on the trees around George Langley's body. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as he looked at the symbol. "What is this?" "It's an old mark," Clara explained. "A sigil, they called it. Belongs to a secret pact made by the town's founders. They believed it would bring prosperity and protect them from outside threats. But there was a price, blood." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You're saying the town's founders made a deal with what exactly?" Clara's voice lowered to a near whisper. "Something ancient, something they didn't fully understand. And now it seems that deal is coming back to collect." A sudden creak echoed through the quiet room, and both turned to see Sheriff Miller standing in the doorway. His face was set in a deep scowl. "Clara," he said sternly, You know better than to be filling this outsider's head with old stories. Clara didn't flinch. He needs to know, John, the killings aren't going to stop, not until the debt is paid. Miller's gaze shifted to Marcus, his eyes hardening. You're playing a dangerous game, detective. I'd watch my step if I were you. Marcus felt the tension rise between them, but he kept his expression steady. I'm just here to find the truth, Sheriff. Whatever that might be. Miller turned and walked out, his heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway. Clara watched him go, her face pale but determined. You'd better be careful, she warned. Miller's not the only one who doesn't want the truth to come out. This town has a way of swallowing people whole. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a cold fog. Then I guess I'd better keep digging. Marcus left the archives, with his mind buzzing. The deeper he delved into the town's history, the more it felt like he was walking into a labyrinth with no way out. As he made his way through the fog-choked streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him, lurking in every shadow and behind every window. He needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them, his sister, Evelyn. He hadn't seen her in years, not since he'd left this town and tried to put his father's shadow behind him. Evelyn had stayed, choosing to face the whispers and the stares while Marcus had escaped, leaving her to deal with the fallout of their father's sins. And she had never forgiven him for it. Her small house stood at the end of a quiet street, nearly hidden by the thick mist. Marcus hesitated at the gate, his hand hovering over the latch. He could already see her silhouette in the window, standing motionless, watching him. He took a deep breath and pushed open the gate, the rusty hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. When she opened the door, Evelyn's face was hard and cold. She was a mirror of their mother, sharp features, intense eyes that bore into his soul. Marcus, she said, her voice flat. I was wondering how long it would take before you showed up. Evelyn, I need to talk to you, Marcus said, keeping his tone steady. About Dad, and what's happening in this town. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. You mean the murders? She stepped aside, letting him in. You're wasting your time, you know. Whatever you think you're going to uncover, you won't like it. Inside, the house was dim and cluttered, filled with old photographs and dusty relics of their childhood. Marcus could feel the weight of the past in every corner, pressing down on him like a physical force. Why didn't you tell me about Dad's involvement in all this? He asked, unable to hide the accusation in his voice. Because it wouldn't have changed anything. Evelyn shot back, her eyes blazing. You left, Marcus. You left me here to deal with all of it on my own. What good would it have done to drag you back into it? Marcus clenched his fists, his anger boiling just beneath the surface. You should have told me. Maybe then I could have done something. Done what? Evelyn interrupted, her voice rising. You think you could have stopped this? You think you could have undone what he did? This town has been cursed for generations because of men like our father. The blood's on all our hands, Marcus, whether we like it or not. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Marcus felt a pang of guilt twist inside him. So what do we do now? He asked quietly. Just let it keep happening? Evelyn's expression softened just a fraction. Maybe it's too late to stop it, she said, almost to herself. Maybe we're just too deep in it. Marcus shook his head, refusing to accept that answer. There has to be a way. If I could find out what our father was really involved in, what he did to start all this, maybe I can put an end to it. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching. Then, finally, she sighed. You're not going to let this go, are you? No, Marcus said firmly. I'm not. Then be careful, she warned, her voice low. This town has a way of dragging people down, and it doesn't care who you are or what you're trying to do. As Marcus turned to leave, he caught sight of his own reflection in a dusty mirror on the wall. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move behind him, a dark, twisted shape that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He glanced back, but Evelyn was already staring out the window, lost in thought. Stepping back into the foggy street, Marcus felt the weight of the town's secrets pressing on him more heavily than ever. He needed to get to the bottom of this, and fast. The fog settled even thicker over the town as dusk fell, swallowing the last traces of daylight. Marcus couldn't shake the chill that had taken root deep in his bones since leaving Evelyn's house. He found himself wandering back toward the forest, drawn to the scene of the first murder as if some unseen force was pulling him there. The forest entrance loomed ahead, the trees standing like ancient sentinels guarding secrets too terrible to reveal. Marcus paused, the heavy weight of dread settling in his stomach. He should turn back, he thought, but something pushed him forward. An instinct, or maybe just a stubborn need to confront whatever darkness lay hidden within these woods. He walked deeper into the forest, his footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. His flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to shift and writhe at the edges of his vision. The memory of the symbols carved into the trees flickered in his mind, and he found himself scanning the trunks, searching for those strange, serpentine marks. Then he saw it, a faint glow ahead, like a pale firefly in the mist. He moved closer cautiously, his hand instinctively reaching for the grip of his gun. The glow resolved into a symbol carved into a tree, the same one he'd seen before. But this time it seemed to pulse with a dim, eerie light, as if the tree itself was alive and breathing. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and he took a step back, his instinct screaming at him to leave. But it was too late. A sudden rush of wind swept through the forest, snuffing out the mist and sending a cascade of dry leaves swirling into the air. And then he saw it, the wraith. It was a shadow at first, a mere suggestion of form in the darkness. But as he stared, it seemed to solidify, taking on a grotesque shape, a twisted figure with elongated limbs and a face that was more a void than a visage. It hovered just beyond the circle of his flashlight's beam, its presence radiating a bone-deep cold that stole the breath from Marcus's lungs. "Leave," a voice hissed, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. The sound scraped against his mind like nails on glass. "This is not your place." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stand his ground. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear tightening around his throat. "What do you want?" The wraith's form twisted and writhed, like smoke caught in a vortex. "Justice," it hissed, "for the sins of the fathers." The word sent a jolt through Marcus. He thought of his own father, of the secrets Evelyn had hinted at. "Is this about my father?" he asked, his voice hardening. "What did he do?" A low, mournful wail filled the air, a sound that was both a laugh and a scream. "The blood of the guilty runs through you," the wraith whispered, "and it will flow again." Marcus's grip tightened on his flashlight. "I'm not my father," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let whatever he did destroy this town." The wraith moved closer, just at the edge of the light, its form distorting and contorting like a living shadow. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it murmured. "The debt must be paid in blood." Before Marcus could respond, the wraith surged forward, and for a moment he felt an overwhelming cold, a darkness that filled his mind with images, flashes of fire, of bodies hanging from trees, of his father's face twisted in fear and anger. He stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight, and the wraith dissolved into the mist, leaving him alone in the darkened forest. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he forced himself to steady his shaking hands. The forest was silent once more, but the weight of the encounter clung to him like a second skin. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just some figment of the townspeople's imagination. It was real, and it had a purpose. He made his way back to the edge of the forest, his mind racing. The wraith had spoken of justice, of a debt owed in blood, and somehow, his father's sins were tangled up in all of it. He needed more answers, and there was only one person who could provide them, Clara Mitchell. With a final glance back at the shadowed trees, Marcus hurried back toward the town. He had a feeling time was running out, and the Wraith's warning echoed in his mind with every step. The wind had picked up by the time Marcus reached the town archives. Dark clouds gathered above, threatening rain, and the streets were empty save for a stray cat slinking along the alleyways. He hurried inside, shaking off the chill that clung to him from the forest encounter. Inside, the dim lighting of the archives cast long shadows across the dusty shelves, adding to the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to fill every corner of the building. Clara was waiting for him, seated at a long wooden table near the back. Several old books and documents lay scattered before her, their brittle pages filled with faded writing and symbols. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp with anticipation. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Clara said, her voice low, but laced with a hint of dark amusement. Marcus didn't bother with pleasantries. "I saw it, Clara. The Wraith. Out in the woods," he said, his tone urgent. "It spoke to me about justice, about my father's sins. It said something about a debt in blood." Clara's face turned pale, and she nodded slowly. "Then it's true," she murmured, almost to herself. "The curse is waking up again." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I need to know everything about the pact, about what the founders did, and about my father's role in all of this." Clara sighed, glancing down at the documents spread out before her. "It started over 100 years ago, when this town was just a handful of families trying to make a life in these woods," she began. "There were struggles, famine, disease, threats from outsiders. Desperate to survive, the founders made a pact with something ancient, something they didn't understand. The Wraith," Marcus said, piecing it together. "Not just the Wraith," Clara corrected, her eyes meeting his. "The Wraith is just a manifestation, an enforcer, if you will. The real power is older, deeper. The founders believed they could control it, use it to protect the town and ensure its prosperity. But it came with a price: blood. Every generation, a blood sacrifice had to be made to keep the pact alive." Marcus's stomach tightened. And if the sacrifice wasn't made? Clara's eyes darkened. Then the Wraith would come, to exact its own form of justice. And it would claim not just the guilty, but their descendants as well. That's why it's back now, because the pact was broken. Marcus absorbed her words, his mind racing. "And my father?" he pressed. "What did he have to do with it?" Clara hesitated, a flicker of conflict crossing her face. "Your father was part of a group who tried to break the cycle, to end the pact once and for all," she said. "But they underestimated the power they were dealing with. Whatever they did, it backfired. They didn't just break the pact, they enraged it. And now it's coming for everyone." A heavy silence settled between them. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows like some distant, hungry beast. Marcus felt a deepening sense of dread. "So, the murders, they're just the beginning?" Clara nodded. "The Wraith is only going to grow stronger. It feeds on fear, on guilt. And until the debt is paid, it won't stop." Marcus's jaw tightened. "There has to be a way to end this," he said, his voice hard with determination. "A way to break the curse without more bloodshed." Clara looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "There might be," she said carefully. "There are legends, fragments of stories passed down, about a ritual that could sever the bond between the town and the ancient force. But it's risky, dangerous, and it would require someone to face the Wraith directly, to confront it with the full weight of the sins committed." Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'll do it, whatever it takes." Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "You don't know what you're asking, detective. The Wraith is not just a spirit, it's a force of retribution. It will dig into your very soul, use your own fears and guilt against you. If you're not strong enough—" "I don't have a choice," Marcus interrupted. "This is my mess to clean up, my family's mess, and I'm not letting anyone else die for it." Clara studied him for a moment, then slowly nodded. "All right, we'll need to prepare. I'll gather what I can from the archives. Meet me here tomorrow night after dark." As Marcus left the archives, The rain finally began to fall, drumming against the rooftops and streets in a relentless torrent. He looked up at the darkening sky, his mind a whirl of thoughts and fears. The wraith's words still echoed in his head, a cold reminder that time was running out. But he had made his decision. There would be no turning back now. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time Marcus reached Evelyn's house. The fog still hung low over the streets, swirling around him like ghosts clinging to the town's forgotten sins. He knew that if he was going to confront the wraith and break the curse, he needed to clear the air with his sister. She knew more than she'd let on. And if he was going to survive what lay ahead, he needed her on his side. Evelyn opened the door with a wary look, her face drawn and tired. "Back again," she said, her tone flat. "You never could leave well enough alone, could you, Marcus?" He pushed past her into the small, dimly lit living room. "We don't have time for this, Evelyn. I need to know everything about Dad, about what he was involved in. Clara says there might be a way to end this, but I need to know what we're dealing with." Evelyn closed the door slowly, leaning against it as if she needed its support. Her eyes narrowed, studying him. "And you trust Clara? She's one of them, Marcus. Her family was there at the beginning. They were part of the pact." Marcus shook his head. "I don't know who to trust, but I don't have a choice. The wraith is out there, and it's not going to stop. If there's a chance to break this curse, I have to take it." Evelyn's shoulders slumped, and she crossed her arms, her gaze shifting to the floor. "You really don't get it, do you? Dad didn't just try to break the pact. He was obsessed. He dragged us all into it, trying to find a way out. He thought he could outsmart whatever it was he'd made a deal with. And he failed," Marcus said quietly. "And now we're all paying the price." Evelyn's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't get to play the martyr, Marcus. You left. You ran away and left me to clean up the mess. Do you know what it was like? Watching him lose his mind, hearing him talk about the things he'd seen, the things he'd done, and knowing that someday it would come for us too?" Marcus's face tightened. "I know I should have been here," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I'm here now, and I'm trying to make it right." Evelyn was silent for a long moment, her gaze piercing through him. Then, finally, she sighed, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "Dad was convinced there was a ritual that could sever the bond," she said. "But it required more than just knowledge. It needed a confrontation with the wraith itself, a direct challenge. And it demanded a confession, not just of his sins, but of all the sins that had been committed by those bound to the pact." "Clara said something similar," Marcus replied. "But why didn't he go through with it?" Evelyn's expression darkened. "Because he was a coward," she said bitterly. "He couldn't face his own guilt, let alone the sins of everyone else. And he knew that if he tried and failed, the wraith would take him, and anyone close to him." Marcus felt the weight of her words settle on him like a stone. "So it's up to me now," he said quietly. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes softer now, but filled with a deep, weary sadness. "Just promise me one thing, Marcus," she said. "If you're going to do this, don't do it for Dad. Do it for the people here, the ones who never asked for any of this." Marcus nodded, a flicker of resolve igniting in his chest. "I promise." As he turned to leave, Evelyn's voice stopped him. "Be careful, Marcus. The wraith isn't just going to test you. It's going to break you if it can." He glanced back at her, offering a thin, determined smile. "Let it try." The rain picked up again as he stepped outside, washing over him like a baptism. He could feel the weight of what was coming, the confrontation with the wraith looming like a dark cloud over his soul. But he was ready, or as ready as he would ever be. The night air was thick with tension as Marcus made his way back to the archives. The rain had turned the narrow streets into muddy rivers, and the cold seeped through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. He knew this would be his last chance to confront the wraith and end the curse once and for all. The weight of that reality bore down on him, but he forced himself to keep moving. Clara was waiting inside, just as she'd promised. She had already laid out several items on the table, a collection of old, yellowed pages filled with hand-drawn symbols, a thick candle, a small brass bowl, and a knife with a wickedly sharp blade. She looked up as Marcus entered, her expression grim and resolute. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. There was no fear in her eyes, just a cold determination. Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "Ready as I'll ever be." Clara wasted no time. "We're going to need to recreate the original ritual," she explained, her voice calm but urgent. "We'll use the symbols to draw the wraith to us, and then you'll need to confront it. If the stories are true, it will test you. It'll try to break you with the sins of the past. But if you can hold your ground, there's a chance we can sever the bond." "A chance," Marcus repeated, his voice heavy with skepticism. "And what happens if it doesn't work?" Clara hesitated, her eyes dropping to the table. "Then it'll take what it's owed. All of it." He understood what she wasn't saying. If the ritual failed, he'd likely join the Wraith's growing collection of victims. But he couldn't back down now. "Let's get to it," he said firmly. Together, they prepared the ritual site in the basement of the archives, a room steeped in the weight of history and shadowed by the deeds of those who had come before. Clara lit the candle and began to arrange the symbols in a circle around Marcus, carefully inscribing each one on the cold stone floor with white chalk. As she worked, the wind outside began to howl, rattling the windows and sending a shiver through Marcus's spine. It was as if the entire town was bracing for what was to come. The basement seemed to grow colder, and Marcus could almost feel the presence of the wraith lurking at the edges of his mind, waiting. Once everything was in place, Clara handed Marcus the brass bowl and the knife. "You'll need to make a small cut," she instructed, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of urgency. "Just enough to draw blood. It'll act as a conduit, an offering to call the wraith." Marcus nodded, taking the knife. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing the blade to his palm, wincing as he sliced the skin. Blood welled up and dripped into the bowl. The room seemed to darken immediately, and the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. The candle flame flickered violently, and then it happened. A low, keening wail filled the air, rising in pitch and intensity until it became a bone-chilling scream. Shadows shifted and coalesced in the corners of the room, and the temperature plummeted. The wraith had arrived. It emerged from the darkness like a thing being born, twisting and writhing, its form an ever-changing mass of shadows and shapes. Its void-like face turned toward Marcus, and for a moment, he felt an overwhelming urge to look away, to flee. But he held his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "Marcus Reed," the wraith intoned, its voice a guttural rasp that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. "You carry the blood of the guilty." Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stand tall. "I'm here to end this," he said. "Whatever debt is owed, it ends tonight." The wraith seemed to shudder, its form becoming more defined, more menacing. "You think you can escape the sins of your father?" it hissed. "You think you can atone for what has been done?" Suddenly, the room was filled with visions, flashes of the past. Marcus saw his father, wild-eyed and frantic, performing a ritual much like this one. He saw the men and women who had been sacrificed, heard their screams, felt their terror. And then he saw himself, covered in blood, standing over the bodies. "No!" Marcus shouted, his voice breaking. "I'm not my father." The wraith's laughter was like nails on a chalkboard, a sound that made his skin crawl. "The blood is the same," it whispered. "The guilt is the same. You cannot change what you are." Marcus felt the room closing in on him, the walls pressing in, the air growing thinner. His mind swirled with doubt, with fear, with the weight of his father's sins pressing down on him. But he forced himself to remember Evelyn's words, to do this for the people who didn't ask for any of this. "I'm not here to atone for my father," he said, his voice steadier now. "I'm here to break this curse, for them." The wraith let out a deafening roar, its form erupting into a storm of shadows that filled the room. Marcus braced himself, knowing this was the point of no return. The shadows surged around Marcus, swirling like a maelstrom of darkness that clawed at his mind and soul. The basement seemed to expand and contract with each breath, the air thickening with every passing second. Marcus tightened his grip on the knife, his bloodied palm burning with pain. But he refused to let go. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to face the Wraith and whatever horrors it would throw at him. The Wraith's form became more defined within the chaos, its limbs elongated and grotesque, its void-like face twisting into a mockery of a human expression. It moved closer, a low growl rumbling from deep within its chest like the warning of some primal beast. Marcus could feel it probing at the edges of his mind, searching for a weakness, an entry point into his deepest fears and regrets. "You cannot escape what is in your blood," the Wraith hissed, its voice like rusted metal scraping against stone. "You are bound to it, bound to the sins of your father and his father before him." Images exploded in Marcus's mind, visions of his father standing in this very basement, surrounded by the same symbols, his eyes wide with madness and desperation. He saw the ritual, the same one he was now attempting, but his father's face contorted in fear as the Wraith appeared, its form more monstrous and undefined. The terror in his father's eyes, the pleading in his voice as he begged for mercy, only to be consumed by the darkness. "I am not my father," Marcus shouted, forcing the words through the fear that gripped his throat. "I choose to end this, not to perpetuate it." The Wraith's laughter filled the room, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction at once. "And yet here you stand, knife in hand, blood on the floor. You think you are different, but the blood remembers. The blood always remembers." The shadows pressed in tighter, and Marcus felt his own will falter under the weight of his doubts. The Wraith fed on his fear, his uncertainty, and he knew that if he let it, it would consume him as it had consumed so many before. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the visions, the whispers, the faces of the dead staring at him with hollow eyes. "Focus, Marcus." He heard Clara's voice faintly, a small anchor in the storm of his thoughts. "Remember why you're here." He opened his eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The Wraith loomed closer, its dark tendrils reaching out as if to pull him into its cold embrace. But Marcus didn't back down. He held his ground, his mind latching onto the faces of the people who had suffered because of this curse. George Langley, the recent victims, even Evelyn, who had borne the weight of their father's sins for so long. "This ends now," Marcus said, his voice steadier, a growl of defiance rising from his chest. He stepped forward into the circle of symbols and raised the knife. For them, the Wraith recoiled slightly, its form flickering, the darkness around it wavering. It seemed almost confused by his sudden surge of determination. "You are a fool," it snarled. "You cannot sever what is bound by blood." "I can break the chain," Marcus countered. "I can choose to face the truth and end this madness." And with that, he plunged the knife into the brass bowl filled with his blood. The symbols on the floor began to glow, not with the sickly, unnatural light of the Wraith, but with a warm, golden hue that spread outward like ripples on a pond. The Wraith screamed, a sound that was part rage, part agony, as the light touched its form, burning away the shadows. Marcus gritted his teeth, the pain in his hand intensifying as the energy of the ritual coursed through him. His mind was flooded with memories, his father's guilt, the terror of those who had been sacrificed, the lies and secrets that had held the town in darkness for so long. But he pushed through it, reaching deeper, searching for something pure, something untouched by the curse. "I see you, Wraith," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "I see what you are, just a tool, just a weapon created by the fear and sins of others." The Wraith's form wavered, its face twisting into something almost human, eyes wide, lips curled back in a snarl. "You know nothing," it hissed. "You are nothing." But Marcus knew that wasn't true. He had spent too long running from his past, from his father's sins, from his own fear of becoming like him. He was done running. I am not nothing, he said, louder now, his voice rising with a newfound strength. I am a reed, and I choose to end this cycle. With a final scream, the wraith lunged at him, its form stretching out like a storm of shadows. But as it crossed the threshold of the glowing symbols, it was stopped short, its body convulsing as if struck by an unseen force. The light grew brighter, filling the room, and the wraith began to disintegrate, its screams turning to shrieks of rage and despair. For a moment, Marcus could see something within the shadows, a shape, a figure almost like a person, reaching out with a hand that dissolved into smoke. And then, just like that, it was gone. The room fell silent. The symbols on the floor faded. The candle's flame flickered one last time, and then went out. Marcus dropped to his knees, his body trembling, his breath ragged and shallow. He looked down at his hand, the blood drying on his palm, and let out a long, slow breath. Clara rushed to his side, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and concern. Did it work? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Marcus nodded slowly, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. I think it's over. Outside, the wind died down, and for the first time since he'd arrived in this cursed town, Marcus felt a calm settle over him. The wraith was gone, the bond severed, the curse was broken. But as he stared at the darkened basement, he couldn't shake the feeling that some shadow of the past, still lingered. He knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for the town, one without the wraith, but not without its own ghosts. The next morning, the town woke up to an eerie calm. The fog that had suffocated the streets for days had lifted, revealing a clear sky above and the distant outline of the surrounding hills. It was as if a heavy, invisible weight had been lifted from the air, allowing the town to breathe again. Yet, beneath this newfound calm lay the scars of what had transpired. Marcus stood outside the archives, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He hadn't slept after the confrontation with the wraith, his mind too restless, replaying the events over and over. Clara had stayed with him through the night, quietly tending to his wounded hand and offering what comfort she could. Now, she was speaking with a small group of townspeople who had cautiously approached the archives, drawn by the sounds and strange lights they'd witnessed the night before. Sheriff Miller was among them, his usual stern demeanor replaced by a weary expression. He approached Marcus, his hat clutched in his hands, and for the first time since they'd met, there was a softness in his eyes. It's over, isn't it? Miller asked, his voice low. The killing's the curse. It's finally done. Marcus nodded. The wraith is gone. Whatever hold it had over this place, it's broken now. Miller let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging with relief. Maybe now we can finally start to heal, put all of this behind us. But Marcus wasn't so sure. He had seen what lay buried in this town, the secrets, the sins, the legacies of pain and fear that ran deep. The wraith might be gone, but the scars would remain, both on the land and in the hearts of its people. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Clara joined Marcus, her face drawn and tired but relieved. They'll want answers, she said, nodding toward the departing townsfolk. Explanations. Some will believe the wraith was just a story, a way to make sense of the deaths. Others, well, they've seen enough to know better. Marcus nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. Maybe it's better if some things remain unsaid, he replied. They don't need to know everything. Clara smiled faintly. Maybe, but there's value in knowing the truth, in facing it. It's the only way to make sure it never happens again. Marcus knew she was right. The town's history was written in blood and shadows, and it would take time to shed light on it all. But he also knew he had to leave. This place held too many ghosts, too many memories that weren't his to carry. Later that day, he found himself back at Evelyn's house. She was standing on the porch, her arms crossed as she watched him approach. There was a guardedness in her eyes, but also a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Perhaps understanding, or maybe even forgiveness. It's done, he said simply. Evelyn nodded. I felt it, she replied, like something heavy lifting. But the scars are still there, Marcus. They always will be. I know, Marcus said, but maybe now we can move on, find some kind of peace. Evelyn looked out toward the town, her gaze distant. I don't know if I'll ever find peace here, she murmured, but maybe it's a start. There was a long silence between them, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. Finally, Marcus turned to leave. Take care of yourself, Evelyn, he said, and if you ever need anything. She nodded, a small, almost sad smile tugging at her lips. You too, Marcus. As he walked away, Marcus felt the weight of everything that had happened settle on him like a shadow. The wraith was gone, but its echoes would linger. Still, for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity, a path forward. Maybe not free from the past, but not bound to it either. The road out of town stretched ahead, lined with dense trees that seemed to lean in as if whispering secrets to one another. Marcus drove slowly, his thoughts heavy as the car rolled over the uneven gravel. He could still feel the weight of the past few days, everything he'd seen, everything he'd faced, hanging over him like a fog that refused to lift. The town had been saved, but the scars it bore were still raw and visible, like old wounds reopened. He thought about Clara, staying behind to help the town come to terms with its history. He thought about Evelyn, who would continue to struggle with the memories of their father and what he'd done. And he thought about himself, about the darkness he'd confronted within his own soul. He wasn't sure where he was headed now, only that he needed to get away, to put distance between himself and the shadows that clung to that cursed town. As he drove, he glanced over at the passenger seat, where he'd placed the old journal he'd found in the archives, the one detailing the pact, the sacrifices, and the Founders' desperate attempts to control the ancient power they'd unleashed. He had almost left it behind, but decided to keep it, to remind himself of what unchecked fear and desperation could lead to. He reached for the journal, flipping it open to the last page, where he had left off. His breath caught in his throat when he saw it. There was a new entry, one that hadn't been there before, written in his own handwriting. The blood of the guilty may be shed, but the shadows never truly fade. They cling, they wait, and they remember. A chill crept up Marcus's spine as he stared at the words. He hadn't written them, he was sure of it. His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat formed on his brow. The wraith might have been banished, but had something else taken its place? Had some remnant of it lingered within him? He closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. The road stretched on ahead, disappearing into the horizon. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. Whatever it was, he would face it, just as he had faced the wraith. There would be no more running. Marcus pressed down on the accelerator, the car picking up speed as it headed toward the unknown.